the land that never let go. Long before it became a prison, the land was already a sentence. The Louisiana State Penitentiary, known simply as Angola, sits on nearly 18,000 acres of low-lying ground in West Feliciana Parish. It is bordered on three sides by the Mississippi River, cut off from towns, highways, and ordinary life. From above, it does not look like a fortress. It looks like farmland. Acres of open fields stretch toward the horizon, broken only by levees, guard towers, and long strips of razor wire. That illusion is deliberate. Angola does not announce itself as a place of punishment. It blends into the land. But the land remembers. Before Angola was a prison, it was several plantations merged together after the Civil War. The name itself comes from Angola, the African region from which many enslaved people were taken before being sold in Louisiana. This is not symbolic interpretation. It is recorded history. State archives, historical surveys, and official documents all acknowledge it. When Louisiana converted the plantations into a penitentiary in the late 1800s, the transformation was minimal. The ownership changed. The labor did not. Men worked the fields under armed supervision. They slept in crowded barracks. They were controlled through violence, fear, and deprivation. What had once been enforced through slavery was now enforced through law. Angola did not reinvent itself. It repurposed what already existed. By the early 20th century, Angola had developed a reputation that never appeared in brochures or official statements. Defense attorneys warned clients about it. Families whispered about it. Former inmates described it as a place where people vanished. Not escaped, disappeared. Sentences sent men there knowing they would never return. Life meant life, and the state did not apologize for that. By the mid-1900s, Angola was infamous even within the American prison system. Violence was routine. Guards were vastly outnumbered. Knives circulated openly. Murders happened so frequently they barely registered beyond local reports. According to sworn testimony later entered into federal court records, the prison was governed less by authority than by fear. Order was not maintained. It was negotiated. The men Angola held were not expected to be rehabilitated. Many were serving life sentences. Appeals were rare. Clemency was nearly non-existent. Once inside, the message was clear: you were not leaving. The outside world largely accepted this. Prisons were supposed to be harsh. Angola was simply honest about it. In the 1950s, that silence cracked in a way so extreme it could not be ignored. A group of incarcerated men staged one of the most disturbing protests in American prison history. According to court filings and contemporary reporting, several inmates intentionally severed their own Achilles tendons. They believed permanent injury was the only way to escape forced field labor. It was not a riot. It was not a demand list. It was a declaration that death or disability felt preferable to life inside Angola. The protest succeeded, but not in the way they hoped. Instead of reform, Angola responded with isolation, punishment, and suppression. The incident faded from public memory. The system remained intact. The message to inmates was unmistakable. Resistance would be erased, not addressed. By the 1970s, Angola had become statistically one of the most violent prisons in the United States. According to data later cited in civil rights litigation, dozens of inmates were killed each year. Many deaths were ruled justifiable. Others were never solved. Guards often did not intervene, not because they were unaware, but because intervention was not the strategy. Investigations and sworn testimony revealed a system built on what critics later called delegated control. Certain inmates were allowed unofficial authority over others. In exchange for privileges, better housing, protection, favors, they enforced order internally. This arrangement reduced costs and shifted responsibility. Violence was contained, but it was also sanctioned. Former prisoners described dormitories where a small number of men controlled access to food, bathrooms, and sleep. Extortion was routine. Sexual assault was common. Complaints went unanswered. One former inmate told investigators in the 1970s that Angola was not guarded. It was managed by prisoners with knives. Internal reports warned of chaos. Medical examiners documented suspicious deaths. The state knew. Nothing changed. For decades, Angola operated this way with little scrutiny. Courts deferred to prison officials. The prevailing legal philosophy of the time held that prisons were inherently dangerous and that judges should not interfere with internal management. What happened behind the walls was considered necessary, even inevitable. That legal shield would not hold forever. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, incarcerated men began filing civil rights lawsuits under Section 1983, alleging violations of the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. At first, the cases went nowhere. Judges dismissed them. Deference remained the norm, but the volume increased. So did the documentation. Affidavits described open dormitories holding hundreds of men with minimal supervision. Guards remained in towers. Inside, power was informal and brutal. Younger or physically smaller inmates were targeted. Those who resisted were beaten or stabbed. Medical records corroborated injuries. Autopsies showed repeated trauma. Psychologists testified to long-term psychological harm. The state denied responsibility. Officials argued that inmate-on-inmate violence was unavoidable, that staffing shortages limited intervention, and that Angola's population, mostly men serving life sentences, made reform unrealistic. But one detail undermined that defense. Internal documents later obtained by journalists showed that prison administrators knew exactly which inmates controlled which areas. They tracked problem dorms. They identified enforcers. They chose not to intervene. Allowing inmates to police each other was cheaper. It reduced visible disorder. It kept violence contained within the population. This was not negligence. It was policy. By the early 1990s, national attitudes toward incarceration began to shift. Investigative journalists started paying closer attention. Human rights organizations began documenting prison conditions. Angola's size, history, and death toll made it impossible to ignore. Then, in 1995, Louisiana appointed a new warden. His name was Burro Kane. Kane inherited a prison already under scrutiny. He presented himself as a reformer, a man who could impose order where chaos had reigned. According to state records and interviews, Kane implemented sweeping changes. Dormitories were restructured. Movement was restricted. Discipline was intensified. Surveillance increased. The use of inmate enforcers was curtailed. The results were immediate and measurable. Inmate-on-inmate killings dropped dramatically. Violence declined. On paper, the reforms worked. Kane invited the media inside. Journalists toured Angola and saw something they had never seen before: calm. Classrooms, churches, organized labor, structure. Angola was rebranded. Lawmakers praised it as proof that strict control worked. Media outlets called it a model prison. Kane became one of the most famous wardens in America. He gave interviews. He hosted events. He framed Angola as a place where the worst of the worst could be managed, even redeemed. But that was only one version of the story. According to lawsuits filed by inmates and advocacy groups, the apparent peace came at a cost. Solitary confinement expanded dramatically. Racial segregation persisted. Forced labor continued under threat of punishment. Religious participation was incentivized. Compliance determined access. One area drew particular concern: death row. For decades, death row at Angola operated under near total isolation. Men were confined to small cells for 23 hours a day. Outdoor recreation was rare. Human contact was minimal. Some prisoners spent decades without meaningful interaction. In 2015, a federal judge ruled that these conditions violated the Constitution. Court filings described isolation so extreme it caused psychological harm. One man had been held in solitary for over 40 years. The ruling forced changes, but it also opened the door to deeper scrutiny. As journalists and civil rights attorneys dug further, allegations surfaced that went beyond harsh conditions. Claims of guard brutality, smuggling, sexual abuse, retaliation against whistleblowers. Some allegations were proven in court. Others remained disputed. What could not be disputed was this: Angola was no longer invisible. In 2016, Burl Cain resigned abruptly. According to news reports, his resignation followed an investigation into alleged misuse of prison resources, including claims that inmate labor had been used for personal projects. Cain denied wrongdoing. No criminal charges were filed. But the image of Angola as a success story fractured. Former guards spoke anonymously to reporters. Former inmates went public. Advocacy organizations released detailed reports describing systemic abuse. A culture emerged in which loyalty mattered more than legality, and silence was rewarded. Angola remained open. It still housed thousands of men. Many were serving life without parole. The average sentence length was among the longest in the nation. The prison still farmed its land using inmate labor, a practice permitted under the 13th Amendment's exception allowing forced labor as punishment for a crime. Critics called it slavery by another name. The state disagreed. The law allowed it. Angola, as it became clear, was not a single story. It was a system layered over centuries, built on exploitation, maintained by neglect, and defended by tradition. To understand its corruption, one had to understand how long it had been allowed to exist this way. Because the most disturbing question was not what happened inside Angola. It was why it took America more than 100 years to start paying attention to Angola. Time does not pass the way it does outside. Men arrive with sentences measured not in years, but in permanence. Life without parole is not a metaphor here. It is an expectation. New arrivals are told early, sometimes by guards, sometimes by other inmates, that counting days is pointless. Birthdays stop mattering. Release dates are a fantasy. The future becomes a narrow corridor. Work, sleep, survive. For many incarcerated men, Angola is not a phase of life. It is the final location of it. The prison holds one of the largest populations of people serving life sentences in the United States. For decades, parole was nearly impossible. Clemency was rare. Appeals took years, often decades, and most failed. The message was reinforced by the institution itself. Angola was designed for people who would die inside it. This reality shaped everything. Housing assignments were not temporary placements. They were destinations. Jobs in the fields were not part of a rehabilitation program. They were daily routines meant to last a lifetime. Friendships were formed with the understanding that funerals would eventually replace farewells. The men who lived this way learned to adapt or break. Former inmates in court testimony describe a psychological shift that occurred after several years inside Angola. Hope did not disappear suddenly. It eroded. At first, men talked about appeals. Then they talked about transfers. Eventually, many stopped talking about leaving at all. Conversations became smaller. Plans shortened. Survival replaced ambition. Mental health care was limited. Depression, anxiety, and trauma were common, but often untreated. In disciplinary reports later reviewed by federal courts, self-harm incidents appeared regularly. Suicide attempts were documented. Some succeeded. Others were quietly recorded and forgotten. Those who could not adjust became vulnerable. In Angola's dormitories, weakness was visible. Men who showed fear were targeted. Those without allies were exploited. For decades, sexual violence was an open secret. Lawsuits filed in the 1970s and 1980s describe assaults that went unreported because reporting changed nothing or made things worse. One inmate affidavit entered into federal court described begging guards for help after repeated threats. According to the affidavit, no action was taken. Days later, the inmate was attacked. Medical records confirmed severe injuries. The case was dismissed. Stories like this accumulated. The legal system initially treated them as isolated incidents. Judges accepted the argument that prisons were dangerous by nature. Violence was expected. The Constitution, courts ruled for years, did not require prisons to be safe, only not deliberately cruel. That interpretation began to collapse as patterns emerged. By the late 20th century, Angola had produced a generation of men who had spent 20, 30, even 40 years inside the same walls. Some had entered as teenagers. They aged visibly behind bars. Hair turned gray. Bodies slowed. Medical issues multiplied. And still, they remained classified as maximum security threats. Among them were men who maintained their innocence. Wrongful conviction cases were not unique to Angola, but the prison's population made them especially stark. Life sentences meant there was time, decades, for evidence to be re-examined, witnesses to recant, and forensic methods to be challenged. One of the most widely known cases involved a group later referred to as the Angola Three. Albert Woodfix, Herman Wallace, and Robert King were accused of killing a prison guard in the early 1970s. The cases relied heavily on inmate testimony, much of it later disputed. There was no physical evidence conclusively linking them to the crime. All three men were placed in solitary confinement. Not for months, not for years, for decades. Wallace and Woodfix each spent more than 40 years in isolation. Their cells were small. Human contact was minimal. Outdoor recreation, when allowed, took place alone in fenced enclosures. According to court filings and psychological evaluations, the conditions caused severe mental and emotional harm. Human rights organizations took notice. Amnesty International, among others, labeled the confinement cruel and inhumane. Legal teams filed repeated appeals. Courts initially upheld the convictions. Then slowly, cracks appeared. Witness credibility was questioned. Prosecutorial misconduct was alleged. Evidence handling was scrutinized. In 2013, Herman Wallace was released after a federal judge overturned his conviction. He died days later from cancer. Albert Woodfix was released in 2016 after his conviction was overturned for a third time. Robert King had been released earlier after his conviction was reversed. No one was retried. The cases drew international attention to Angola. They forced the public to confront a question that had been buried for years. How many men inside Angola were there because of justice? And how many were there because the system refused to admit mistakes? Beyond high-profile cases, hundreds of lesser-known inmates filed appeals and habeas petitions. Most failed. Some succeeded quietly. A few revealed disturbing patterns: coerced confessions, unreliable informants, racially biased jury selection, and underfunded defense counsel. Each successful appeal undermined the narrative that Angola housed only the irredeemable. Inside the prison, these cases changed nothing day to day. Men still woke before dawn. They still worked fields under armed supervision. They still lived with the knowledge that release was unlikely. Even exonerations did not lead to systemic reform. They were treated as exceptions, not evidence of a larger problem. The aging population created another crisis. As decades passed, Angola became one of the largest geriatric prisons in the country. Men in wheelchairs lived alongside younger inmates. Chronic illnesses became common. Medical costs soared. Yet compassionate release remained rare. Former wardens argued that the crimes committed were too severe. Victims' families deserved closure. The state maintained its position. Life meant life. Critics countered that punishment without the possibility of mercy was not justice. It was abandonment. Inside Angola, men adapted again. Some turned to religion, not always out of faith, but because churches offered structure and human connection. Others pursued education, earning degrees they would never use outside prison walls. A few became jailhouse lawyers, helping others navigate appeals and filings. These roles gave life shape. Yet even those who found purpose lived with a quiet understanding. They were building meaning inside a system that did not intend to let them go. The men who stopped counting days became living records of Angola's history. They remembered wardens long gone, policies reversed, violence reduced, then replaced with control. They saw the prison rebrand itself while remaining fundamentally the same. They knew where bodies were buried, not literally, but administratively. They understood which reforms were cosmetic and which were real. They had lived through neglect, brutality, and silence. And many of them believed something else was coming. Because as public awareness grew, as lawsuits piled up, and as national conversations shifted toward mass incarceration and wrongful convictions, Angola's isolation began to weaken. The walls were still there, but the silence around them was not. Angola did not become quieter by accident. When violence declined, it was not because anger disappeared or because sentences became shorter. It was because control replaced chaos. Every reform, every rule, every visible improvement inside the prison was tied to one central objective: maintain order in a place where most men had nothing left to lose. Control at Angola was layered. At the top were administrators and wardens, responsible to the state and the public. Below them were ranking officers, captains, and guards, each overseeing housing units, work details, and movement. Beneath that structure, unofficial but powerful, were inmates themselves. For decades, Angola had relied on a system of indirect control. Certain prisoners were given authority over others, sometimes openly, sometimes quietly. They enforced discipline inside dormitories, resolved disputes, and maintained internal order. In return, they received protection, privileges, and leniency. This system reduced staffing needs. It also reduced visible unrest. But it came at a cost that rarely appeared in reports. Men placed under inmate authority lived under constant threat. Compliance was enforced through intimidation and violence. Complaints went nowhere. Guards claimed they could not see everything. Administrators argued that responsibility ended at the tower. When reforms arrived in the 1990s, this system was officially dismantled. But power did not disappear, it changed shape. Instead of relying on inmate enforcers, Angola expanded surveillance, restrictions, and disciplinary tools. Movement was tightly controlled. Housing assignments were more rigid. Infractions were punished swiftly. Solitary confinement became a primary method of control. Isolation was not used only for violence. According to disciplinary records later reviewed in court, inmates could be placed in segregation for minor rule violations, refusing orders, possessing contraband, or being labeled disruptive. Some remained there for months, others for years. In isolation units, days were identical. Cells were small. Interaction was minimal. Noise echoed through concrete corridors. Mental health deterioration was common. Psychologists who later testified in federal cases described symptoms consistent with long-term sensory deprivation: anxiety, paranoia, hallucinations, emotional blunting. Prison officials defended the practice as necessary. They argued that Angola housed men convicted of the most serious crimes. Safety, they said, required strict measures. Courts initially agreed. Judges deferred to prison administrators, citing lack of expertise in corrections. But lawsuits continued. Internal incident reports, obtained through litigation, revealed patterns that contradicted official narratives. Violence had decreased, but at the cost of extreme restriction. Complaints of excessive force surfaced. Allegations of retaliation followed grievances. Whistleblowers, both inmates and staff, claimed consequences for speaking out. Some guards corroborated inmate accounts anonymously. They described understaffing, pressure to maintain statistics, and a culture where discipline mattered more than legality. According to their statements, reports were sometimes altered or minimized to avoid scrutiny. Use of force incidents were underreported. Medical referrals were delayed. The public image of Angola, calm, structured, controlled, did not match what many inside experienced daily. One area where power dynamics became especially visible was labor. Angola is self-sustaining in ways most prisons are not. Inmates farm crops, raise livestock, operate workshops, and maintain infrastructure. The scale is massive. Entire industries exist within the prison. The labor is mandatory for most inmates. Refusal can result in punishment, including loss of privileges or placement in isolation. Wages are minimal, in some cases non-existent. The legal justification is rooted in the 13th Amendment, which permits forced labor as punishment for a crime. Supporters call it productive. Critics call it exploitation. Former inmates described working fields under extreme heat, physical strain, and constant supervision. Injuries occurred. Medical care varied. Those who could not keep up risked disciplinary action. The optics were impossible to ignore. Men, many of them black, working plantation land under armed guards. The parallels to history were not subtle. Journalists pointed it out. Advocacy groups emphasized it. Angola officials rejected the comparison, arguing that work provided structure and reduced idleness. The debate intensified as footage and photographs circulated. Another tool of control was classification. Inmates were assessed and placed into security levels that determined housing, work assignments, and movement. In theory, classification was objective. In practice, inmates alleged it was opaque and punitive. Once labeled high risk, it was difficult to escape that designation. Appeals were limited. Reviews were infrequent. Some inmates spent decades under maximum restrictions, without serious infractions. According to testimony in civil rights cases, behavior improvements did not always result in reclassification. Control, critics argued, had become static. Religion also played a complicated role. Angola became known for its extensive religious programming. Churches were built. Seminary programs were established. Faith-based initiatives were promoted as rehabilitation tools. Participation, however, was not always neutral. Former inmates claimed that those involved in religious programs received better treatment, access, and opportunities. Those who refused were not punished outright, but they were excluded from benefits. The line between encouragement and coercion blurred. Prison officials denied discrimination, stating that faith programs were voluntary and beneficial. Courts struggled to evaluate the claims. Meanwhile, discipline remained absolute. Rules were enforced strictly. Infractions accumulated. Punishment followed. For men serving life sentences, consequences were immediate, not eventual. There was no incentive of early release. Compliance was not rewarded with freedom. It was rewarded with slightly less suffering. This reality shaped behavior. Many inmates complied outwardly while disengaging internally. They followed rules, avoided attention, and accepted restrictions. Others resisted quietly through grievances, lawsuits, or non-cooperation. A few resisted openly and paid for it. Retaliation claims appeared repeatedly in litigation. Inmates who filed grievances reported transfers to harsher units, loss of jobs, or increased scrutiny. Some cases were dismissed. Others resulted in settlements. None produced sweeping reform. The system adjusted, but did not transform. By the early 2000s, Angola was often cited as a paradox. Safer than before, calmer than most maximum security prisons, yet still deeply troubling. Violence statistics improved. Media tours showcased programs and order. But beneath the surface, control remained absolute, and accountability remained limited. Peace had been achieved, but it was fragile. It depended on surveillance, isolation, and compliance. It relied on the understanding that resistance would be met with force or disappearance into segregation. And it left one question unresolved. If order is maintained through suffering, is it order or simply silence?